mulligan. I don't think it'll make a huge difference. This should be a pretty interesting matchup, though. I mean, both these decks are decks that we don't see a whole lot. In particular, this Naya Company deck by Braverman has some pretty interesting card choices. I mean, it's got a 4 main deck Goblin Rabblemaster and 2 Magus of the Moons. So those are some uncommon cards. We don't really see those in Modern too often. It'll be pretty exciting to see how they do in this matchup.
For sure. So we got Michael Braverman, who's currently at 11-2 on Naya Company. Joshua Cho, who's at 11-1-1 on his black-white tokens deck. Josh is just going to lead on a Godless Shrine tapped. Michael Braverman's going to fetch out a Stomping Grounds, take a little bit of damage, and cast a Grim Lavamancer. So he has Lavamancer and Magus of the Moon in his deck. He's only missing Gristlebrand to have the full trio of our game night pins. But Joshua Cho is going to cast an Inquisition, and we're going to see a Plains, a Forest, Magus of the Moon. Looks like we have a Path to Exile, a Lightning Bolt, and a Collected Company. So this is not a bad hand for Michael Braverman.
A really reactive hand, though. I mean, this is predominantly answers. He's not going to have any real pressure onto the board until like turn 4.
However, he does have that Magus of the Moon, which does have the potential to lock up a lot of Joshua's mana, since he only has a couple basics in his deck. He is going to take that with his Inquisition, and I do not blame him.
Yeah, and this should be a pretty interesting matchup because generally speaking, the Naya Company, its threats are much more efficient. Both of these decks are kind of a mix of threats and answers with only a few sources of card advantage. And the Naya Company deck has its advantage is that each individual threat is typically, pretty powerful. It has cards like Tarmogoyf. It's 2 mana for just a really big body. On the other hand, Josh Cho's cards are all token-based, so a lot of them aren't actually that efficient. Lingering Souls is just 3 mana for essentially 2 power and 2 toughness with the potential to flashback, but as soon as he starts getting those Anthem effects online, all of a sudden that stuff starts to scale up. So it'll be pretty interesting to see how these 2 decks interact.
So Michael Braverman is just going to play a Forest and pass. Josh is going to Fetid Heath into a Bitter Blossom, and Braverman's just going to smork it up top with that Lightning Bolt, take some damage. You're going to be damaging yourself with your Bitter Blossom. I'm going to be trying to get some damage on you with this Grim Lavamancer, and it looks like he does have a plan.
Yeah, so I actually kind of like that play quite a bit. You normally wouldn't want to just bolt someone in a matchup like this, but Josh doesn't have that many targets that are actually good to bolt. Also, Braverman doesn't have a lot of attacking power at the moment, and with Josh's Bitter Blossom, Josh is going to be able to develop more and more advantage as the time goes on. So it's really on Braverman's side to try to finish the game early because Josh has a card that can take over the game that can't really be answered.
So Josh is just going to go ahead and draw a card for his turn. Braverman played a Forest, or he played his Plains for the turn, cast a Birds of Paradise. Josh does have a Fairy Rogue, but he has another Bitter Blossom. Now this has the potential to get out of hand, and Michael Braverman is going to try and end this game in a hurry. So we're going to see a Grim Lavamancer activation. I have to imagine that this is going to go towards that Fairy. Might even just go up top if he's planning on using these Lightning Bolts to get in damage on Joshua.
Yeah, this is definitely not the way that Braverman wants the matchup to play out. I mean, essentially he's functioning like a burn deck, but he's really a lot more of a creature deck. So at least this turn he has the option to Collected Company to try to develop a bit more of a board presence. But those 2 Bitter Blossoms are cards that Michael Braverman does not have an answer for, and they can take over the game if it goes long.
Now it looks like he might have picked up a copy of Goblin Rabblemaster, which is something that's going to let him try and contest these Bitter Blossoms. He's going to be able to create a token every turn himself and be able to send it across and put Josh in some positions where he's going to have to make some blocks to prevent himself from taking some damage. But again, those Bitter Blossoms have the chance to take this game over, especially if Josh is able to find something like Intangible Virtue so that he can use those tokens on offense and defense.
Yeah, for sure. And just looking at Braverman's side of the board, I mean, how exciting would it have been to have a turn 1 Birds of Paradise, turn 2 Rabblemaster?
I've done that.
Yeah, I mean...
It was with the Elvish Mystic.
Yeah, I think you did that in Standard, though.
Yeah, I did. It was great. It was great. So Josh is going to go ahead and draw for his turn, pick up a couple more tokens from those Bitter Blossoms, but he is going to fall down to 11 life, which is not a whole bunch considering that Michael Braverman has a Lightning Bolt in his hand and a Grim Lavamancer on the battlefield. So technically, Josh is only at 6, which is 3 turns with those Bitter Blossoms. So he's going to have to try and end this game in a hurry or get some source of life gain going.
Yeah, ideally Josh would hit a Sorin Solemn Visitor at some point. He also has a Vault of the Archangel that he can use to gain life, and he also has his Auroch Champion
Looks like he has a couple copies of Timely Reinforcements in his main deck too, which seem like they could be very, very good in this matchup.
Yeah, another good one.
So Braverman's going to go ahead and use a Lightning Bolt on Josh's end step, take care of one of those fairies, and Josh is going to Path to Exile that Goblin Rabblemaster on Michael's upkeep, which is going to take away quite a bit of his oomph that he had going on that turn.
Yeah, and the reason Josh wants to path it during Braverman's upkeep is Josh knows that Braverman doesn't have anything that he would do in response. He has no blue mana for any kind of counter spell. And if Josh had done it on his own turn, then Braverman would have been able to have that mountain untapped. By doing it on a Braverman's turn, that mountain comes into play this turn, and Path to Exile makes sure that comes into play tapped.
Absolutely. It turns it into a Rampant Growth instead of a Search for Tomorrow.
So I think that Josh is set up pretty well for a very long, protracted game. I think Braverman is going to be the one who really wants to end it quicker.
Absolutely. So I imagine that we're probably looking at some type of Collected Company this turn from Michael. He also has a Path to Exile, so he could get rid of that token and try and get in a little bit of damage right now, but I'm not sure how much of a benefit that's going to be, considering those fairies are going to take the game over fairly quickly.
Yeah, it's pretty tricky because the Path to Exile doesn't really have a better target. If Josh draws a Gideon and activates it into a creature to attack, that's a good Path to Exile target. And then there's also the Auriok Champion, but for the most part, it's just going to be a bunch of tokens.
So it looks like Braverman just went ahead and used his Grim Lavamancer to take care of that Fairy Rogue token and cast a Tarmogoyf. It is only a 2/3 since he's ate the majority of his graveyard away. And now Josh is to the point where he's pumping out 2/2/2 Vigilance flying tokens every single turn. And if this is something like a Lingering Souls or a Spectral Procession, that puts a lot of power and toughness on the board, and it's going to make this tough for Michael Braverman to win.
Yeah, Braverman has done a good job of trying to get some damage across and controlling Josh's board so that Josh hasn't been able to attack Braverman's life total, because Braverman doesn't have very many flyers all in his deck. I mean, it's basically just some Birds of Paradise. So, which match is this? All right.
So if we look at this game, there was 2 fairy tokens that have been killed by a Lightning Bolt and by a Grim Lavamancer at this point. Had those gone to Joshua's Dome, I imagine Michael would have probably taken at most 8 points of damage from those 2 tokens, but Joshua would be down to 3 and be 1 point away from being dead to his own Bitter Blossoms.
Yeah, if Braverman doesn't draw a series of burn spells here, it looks like Josh is going to be able to finish this game in short order. The fact that all of his tokens right now are flying makes it, and that they have vigilance, mean that they're exceptional at playing both offense and defense.
So we're going to see a Collected Company here from Braverman. There is a Magus of the Moon.
A little late for the Magus of the Moon, though. I mean, Josh has the swamp and the plain so that he can still function. And again, these Blood Moon type effects, they're not good when you're behind on the board.
Yeah, he does have a couple Kitchen Finks in his deck, which will give him a little bit of a life buffer. But at this point, he needs to try and survive 4 turns before Josh is able to kill himself with those 2 Bitter Blossom. But it's not looking like that's going to be long enough. He has a whole lot of flying power, and they do have Vigilance.
Yeah, Braverman is going to have a hard time getting any kind of control over this board. It looks like he is going to take the Magus of the Moon. I guess he just didn't really have any other good options, but certainly a tough spot for Braverman. He's really looking to run off some burn spells.
Well, I do like that these creatures are 2 toughness, so that they will die when blocked by these fairies and go into the graveyard. So Braverman is able to actually use his Grim Lavamancer here to put Joshua to 6, and the Bitter Blossoms are going to put him to 4. Then he just needs to be able to attack with enough creatures that will die when blocked, but still represent lethal damage to Josh, so he has to block enough creatures so that he can activate Grim Lavamancer again to put him to 2, and then make him die in his own upkeep to the Bitter Blossoms.
Yeah, a really great point. Josh is going to need some sort of life gain here in order to survive that line of play.
So it looks like here, as far for Braverman, I imagine he's probably going to attack with that Tarmogoyf. At the very least, it's going to get one of those blockers off the board for Josh. I also, I wouldn't attack with the Goblin. It really isn't going to do much.
No.
But Josh is going to triple block, which is going to allow Braverman to get one of those tokens off the battlefield and put another creature into his graveyard.
Yeah, this is a good trade for Braverman. It also makes it so that Josh won't have quite enough pressure to kill Michael in, on 2 turns. Currently, Josh is going to be able to attack for 6, and on the next turn, attack for 10, which will leave Braverman at 1.
Yeah, making this be a 3-turn game instead of a 2-turn game is huge. Now, he could just have another creature in his, or another token generator in his hand, or maybe even another intangible virtue to change the clock. But as it stands, Braverman's just going to be able to shoot Josh, untap, send some attackers in, and make Josh be forced to block. And at that point, he will be able to just shoot him again and win the game. So we do have another intangible virtue from Josh Cho, which is going to bring these tokens up to beefy 3/3 Flying Vigilance. And Braverman's going to take the 9, use his Birds of Paradise on Josh's end step, shoot him for 2 with his Grim Lavamancer. And that's going to put Josh Cho all the way down to 4, which means that both this Magus of the Moon and Voice of Resurgence are lethal attackers.
Yeah, Josh is really set up to take control of this game. He just needs a little extra life. He really needed to find a source of life gain or a removal spell for that Grim Lavamancer. But as it stands now, Michael Braverman has, juggled things just enough so that he controlled Josh's board a little bit while also pushing a fair amount of damage. And with the help of those Bitter Blossoms, it looks like Braverman's going to, despite having fallen behind on the board, he's still able to knock Josh's life total to 0.
And a lot of this game plan goes all the way back to where on turn 2, Braverman bolted Josh Cho on his end step after he cast the first Bitter Blossom, knowing, all right, we need to make this game about life totals here and now because that's what it's going to turn into. And looks like Braverman is going to take Josh Cho down to 2, and he is going to die to his own Bitter Blossoms in his upkeep, similar to what would happen to some unfortunate Fairies players back on the Lorwyn era Standard.
Yeah, and that game has got to have Josh feeling a little worried because Michael Braverman's draw wasn't actually that great. He did not start with a lot of pressure. This Naya Company deck, is a deck that has Wild Nikado. It can have a turn 2 Goblin Rabblemaster. It's got Tarmogoyf. Michael Braverman can come out with a lot of early pressure. And that game, Michael Braverman, he really didn't do very much on the, the first 3 turns or so, and was still able to mount enough of an offense to take the game from Josh, despite Josh having both of his Bitter Blossoms, which are, really good cards that you want early.
So let's go ahead and take a look at the sideboards to see what kind of options these two players do have against each other. We'll start with Michael Braverman and his Naya Company deck. He is currently up a game. He has 3 Lightning Helix, a Dismember, 3 copies of Stony Silence, 4 copies of Blood Moon, 2 Rending Volley and Ancient Grudge, and a Crumble to Dust. It looks like Michael Braverman does not want to lose to big mana decks this weekend.
Yeah, so I have to imagine that a lot of this is going to have to do with just wanting to take certain cards out. For example, Braverman has 4 Path to Exiles that are really not particularly good in the matchup. Cards like Lightning Helix and Dismember are not particularly good either, but they're certainly going to be better than Path to Exile. The other card that you want to take a good look at it also is Blood Moon. If Michael Braverman can land an early Blood Moon, particularly when he's on the play, that can be a great way to steal a game. And Braverman, he can play that Blood Moon on turn 2, which is a pretty big deal.
As far as looking at Joshua's deck, he does have 2 Duress, 3 Fulminator Mage, 1 Disenchant, 1 Kataki, 1 Worship, 3 Stony Silence. It's like the Stony Silence mirror match here.
Yeah.
2 Rest in Peace and 2 Surgical Extraction. That's the one we were thinking of earlier. What do you think that he's going to go ahead and go with?
So I don't think that Josh is really going to want to bring in very much. He doesn't want to have too much discard in his deck. The Inquisition of Kozilek can be a little on the medium side because Braverman's going to empty his hand. So I don't think he's actually going to bring in much of anything. Maybe the Fulminator Mages just because they're marginally better than discard.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. There really isn't a whole much on both sides, actually. It feels like this is just going to be a matchup where Braverman needs to get in as much damage as he possibly can and then try and burn Joshua Cho out.
Yeah, both of these decks are kind of fringe strategies, so it's not surprising that neither of them really have any potent sideboard cards against each other.
So now, as we mentioned earlier, Michael Braverman is just missing Grizzlebrand from his deck to have.
That's true. He's got Magus to the Moon, and he's got the Grim Lavamancer.
But if you are a big fan of Grizzlybrand, we do have playmats, sleeves, and player bundles for our StarCityGames.com creature collection. You can find these at go.starcitygames.com/creature collection, and you can get these sweet things with Grizzly brand on the art, and he is an intimidating Grizzly, but I have heard from some sources that he is a big cuddly teddy bear.
Yeah, I don't know about that with those Rudy arms, but I think we should get one of these for Braverman. You know, he could play his deck on the mat, and he'd be able to have his, you know, Grizzly brand, his Llamamancer, and his other creature.
Magus
also.
of the Moo.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you.
Now we also have the cute zebra. So you can get these in playmat sleeves and player bundles. We have been polling Twitter, trying to get some ideas.
We've had some good
trying to
ones.
get some ideas for some names. Striper Z is one that somebody came up with as an homage to Franker Z, a big Twitch emoticon. I think that's kind of funny.
Yeah, I like that one a lot too. I'm still a little partial to the Z stripes, but you know, Striper Z, whatever else, you know, whatever you want to call it, if it's your playmat, you can name it yourself.
So again, go to StarCityGames.com/creature collection for the zebra. Let's go ahead and hop back to our match and see if our players are ready to go. And it looks like they are a little bit ahead of us. So
wow, off to the races.
So Josh Cho has got a turn 2 Oriok champion. Braverman just started off on a Noble Hierarch. And so we could be seeing a turn 2 Goblin Rabblemaster if he has one.
So one thing that's really interesting about this is the way that Josh lost last game was simply because his life total fell too low. He had complete control over the board, but he did not have complete control over his life total. This Oriok champion has the opportunity to not only be a bit of a roadblock, but also a good source of life gain. The other thing, too, is it'll be interesting to see if Michael Braverman took out those Path to Exiles, like I suggested in sideboarding, because if he has, he probably will not have any way to actually take this champion off the table.
Yeah, and the champion is going to end up gaining quite a bit of life over the course of this game. Michael Braverman is going to be putting a lot of creatures on the battlefield. Joshua Cho is also going to be putting a lot of creatures on the battlefield. So it's going to be interesting to see how it just impacts the match.
Yeah, already, you know, doing a bit of work. Michael Braverman has had a good draw, but this Oriok champion is going to be a lot to overcome.
So Josh has gone ahead and drawn a card for his turn. It looks like we've got a Marsh Flats is the land play for the turn, and he has, looks like a couple different options in his hand. It does look like he brought in Warship, so he could be thinking that his opponent might have taken out those Path to Exiles and could just be actually locked out with Oriok Champion Warship.
Yeah, that would be an exciting and sweet backdoor way to win.
Also, in addition to that, Michael Braverman doesn't really have a lot of ways to deal with a whole bunch of creatures all at once. And so just as long as he's able to keep pumping out tokens with Lingering Souls and Bitter Blossom, that Warship could just make it so he's just never dead.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like that Josh brought it in. It'll be exciting to see where things go, especially if that card hits the table.
Now, it looks like Braverman does not have any red mana. However, he does have 4 mana available for Collected Company if he happens to have it. He is going to crash into the red zone for 4 with his 2/2 Wild Nacatl and his 2/2 Voice of Resurgence. Let's see what his follow-up is.
You know, he doesn't have any red mana, but it doesn't look like he really needs any red mana. I think I see all green cards in his hand.
It definitely would be nice to make that Nacatl a 3/3, though.
Yeah.
So we've got a Tarmogoyf is going to come out to play.
And that Tarmogoyf is currently a 0/1.
And it did gain Joshua Cho 1 life. So
yeah, not quite the efficient powerhouse that we're used to.
At some point, though, he's probably going to get a little bit bigger. I'd be willing to bet.
Yeah.
Now, I wonder if Braverman is thinking about playing another Voice of Resurgence. Looks like he does have another one in his hand.
Yeah, if I was Braverman, I would just try to commit as much power and toughness to the board as possible. You just want to start leaning on Josh Cho with a bunch of creatures.
So it looks like we do have that Voice of Resurgence. Josh is going to gain another life. So he has taken an attack from Braverman, but is still at a healthy life total of 20. And he's going to be passing it back to Josh. Now, it looks like he does have a Gideon Ally of Zendikar in his hand. So if he is able to get that on the battlefield, he can start pumping out 3/3 tokens.
Yeah, it'll be interesting if Josh wants to deploy that without having more protection on the board. Because if Josh just plays it and Braverman attacks with everything, Josh might not actually have particularly good blocks, and he may lose his Gideon anyway. So I would suspect that Josh would prefer to get some other tokens onto the board first, but we'll see. He may be priced into playing that Gideon anyway.
Now, he does have a fetch land, which has the potential to grow that Tarmogoyf, but it's looking like Josh is just going to go with an Inquisition, which is going to grow the Tarmogoyf by 2, since there will be a creature and a sorcery in the graveyard at this point.
So a lot of times in these sort of matchups, depending on how fast the matchup is, and how much you think it's going to come down to a top deck war, you may want to take out your discard spells, but the discard spells can be really good in case you think that you'll always lose to a really fast rush from your opponent. Or, also in this case, Josh just didn't have that many cards to take out.
Now it looks like Josh might have also brought in Rest in Peace, and it looks like that might be the play here, which is going to completely shut off that Tarmogoyf as well as any further Grim Lavamancer shenanigans. Now Josh does have his plains and his swamp on the battlefield, so if Braverman decided to bring in a bunch of Blood Moons, this is just going to negate it.
Yeah, the other thing that Rest in Peace also does is it helps make it so that the persist on Kitchen Finks isn't really a factor.
Definitely. Now, that is going to shut off the flashback on his Lingering Souls, but I think that's a fine price to pay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Josh is doing a pretty good job here of just kind of slowing the game down and really blunting Braverman's offense. At some point, Josh is going to want to get some tokens onto the battlefield so that he can start taking control of the game, but he's certainly doing what he needs to do to draw things out.
At this point, Braverman does have 3 2/2s that he can attack with, which is going to get through some damage, but again, that Auriok Champion is poised to gain Josh a bunch of life back if he's able to ever draw some token generators.
Yeah, a lot of times these Naya Company decks will play something like Kusali Pride Mage, just so they have access to some sort of enchantment removal. It doesn't look like Braverman has any of these, so I don't think he actually has a way of really dealing with that Rest in Peace, even if he wanted to.
Well, it does look like he has a Scavenging Ooze, which is going to add to his ever-growing army of 2/2 creatures.
Yeah.
So at this point, Josh could potentially just start making, he could play that Gideon, which is going to allow him to start pumping out some tokens. The other thing is that he could always just play Warship at some point, and if Braverman can never find an answer to that Auriok Champion, there's just no way that Josh can die.
Yeah, and obviously we don't exactly know how Braverman sideboarded. He may still have some number of Path to Exiles, but a lot of his other removal is in the form of Lightning Bolts, Lightning Helix, and I believe 1 Dismember, which would not be able to target the champion.
So Josh has just gone ahead and played a Lingering Souls, made a couple 2/2 Flying Vigilance creatures, and that's just going to put the halt on Braverman's attack. The actual real interesting thing that Rest in Peace is also going to do is it's going to stop the trigger from Voice of Resurgence, so he's not going to be able to get giant elementals if they do happen to die.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say Josh is set up in a pretty advantageous position from this point. He's going to be able to slowly build up his board, and it's going to be a board that Braverman is never really going to be able to overcome. You combine that with the fact that this Intangible Virtue and the fact that a lot of the tokens are flying means Josh is going to be able to play offense and defense at the same time.
So it looks like Braverman is just going to send in with all of his 2/2s. I imagine he's just going to have to try and whittle through all of these tokens that Josh is going to be able to create.
Yeah, and if Josh can whittle Braverman's board down a little bit, Josh will safely be able to deploy his Gideon, make a token, and basically be guaranteed that it's not going to die.
Yeah, so now at this point, if Braverman does not have another threat to follow up with, we could potentially see Josh play that Gideon here. So he's just going to draw a card, he's going to fetch, and it looks like he might just be playing that Gideon and making a 3/3 Vigilance token.
And with a token factory like Gideon, it's basically that army in the can that you alluded to before. Josh can just sit on this Gideon, and it's going to be producing a creature every single turn that's not completely unlike a lot of Michael Braverman's top decks. So in a certain way, in this board state, this Gideon producing a 2/2, which will be a 3/3 because of the Intangible Virtue, it's almost like drawing an extra card every turn.
On top of that, he's gaining life from the Auriok Champion, from the token entering the battlefield, and this just seems like Josh has done a real good job at putting himself in this position where he can lock things up. It definitely doesn't hurt that Braverman's draw has been a little full of 2/2s and 0/1s, as it seems, because of that Rest in Peace. There was a perfect opportunity there for him to fire off a Collected Company, but he did not have one. It looks like he was able to pick up a Horizon Canopy for the turn. Hopefully he can turn that into some sort of threat. Otherwise, this Gideon is going to slowly take this game over.
Yeah, and comparing this to some of our earlier games is pretty interesting because this is basically a fair game, and this Gideon is a real powerhouse. I mean, like I alluded to before, producing a token every turn because they're going to be 3/3s with that Intangible Virtue, it is pretty close to just drawing an extra card every turn, but in addition, it's almost like that card gets to be cast for free because Gideon doesn't need to be have any more mana sunk into him to be activated. If we compare that, though, to one of the earlier matches that are a lot faster, some of these big mana decks, the Gideon just wouldn't have any really value against something like an Eldrazi.
Now, it looks like we just saw a Path to Exile from Michael Braverman take care of that Gideon token, which means he did leave them in his deck, which means he does have some outs to Auriok Champion, so that could play a little bit of a part in the battle for this warship as the game tends to go longer and longer.
Yeah, this was really good on Michael Braverman's side, because if that Gideon gets a chance to sit on the board for too long, then it's just going to take over the game. So Michael Braverman's basically forcing a situation where Josh has to choose between his Gideon and his champion. Josh valuing the Gideon more is chump blocking with his champion.
So it looks like after that chump block, Michael Braverman is just going to play another 0-1 Tarmogoyf, pass the turn back to Josh Cho. Looks like he's going to pump out a token and then pass the turn back. He does have a Path to Exile in his hand, which is going to allow him to handle one of those attackers. He also has a Slaughter Pact. However, if he does use that Path to Exile, Michael Braverman will be able to get a mountain.
Yeah, there's also the Shambling event, so even on board without looking at Josh's hand, Michael Braverman doesn't really have any profitable attacks because both of his attacking creatures are 2/2s. He could attack with just one and get the Exalted trigger from the Hierarch to make it a 3/3, so at least it trades, but then Michael Braverman is trading one of his whole cards for one of the tokens from Gideon.
And that's not a good place to be in, which it looks like it's what he's doing.
Yeah, I mean, he kind of has to, but you can really see the Gideon pulling its weight where its activated ability is trading with whole cards from his opponent.
So Braverman just has a Scavenging Ooze as the follow-up, and then we're going to pass it back to Josh Cho. So let's see what else kind of hurting he can put on this game. It looks like he's just going to make a token and pass the turn. He does have a Warship, a land, and what appears to be a Path to Exile in his hand.
Yeah, and we're likely to see the same play as last turn. Again, Braverman is just kind of treading water, hoping that Josh Cho sort of floods out and Braverman can draw a Collected Company, maybe something else good to try to get some sort of advantage in this game.
We do have an Inquisition. It looks like a Goblin Rabblemaster got put away. Looks like he has another Goblin Rabblemaster in his hand. No red mana to be able to use it. Just going to make another token from Gideon, shock ourselves with our Godless Shrine, and pass the turn.
And this deck is almost completely green-white. There's very few red cards, so I imagine that this deck runs into these mana issues every once in a while, but the fact that Michael Braverman has gone this long without a red source is definitely something that's unfortunate.
Yeah, it looks like he does have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. He does have 11 red sources in his deck, so that is quite a few.
11 red sources plus the Birds of Paradise?
Plus the Birds of Paradise.
So 12, yeah. I mean, that's pretty light.
So it looks like he was able to finally find a red source with that Arid Mesa. He's going to fetch for a mountain. I imagine we're going to see that lone Goblin Rabblemaster that's left in his hand enter the battlefield. But at this point, it's just going to match up very poorly against those Gideon tokens that he's going to be pumping out. Plus, he still has that Shambling Vents in reserve and 3 whole cards in his hand.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect that if this Rabblemaster hits the board, Josh doesn't even let him go to combat before it dies. So this is now going to be a 4/4 Wild Nikado because of the Noble Hierarch, which is pretty sweet because it means that it can push through that Knight token. So if Josh wants to activate his Shambling event and double block, he has that option, or he can just path it.
Yeah, at this point now that Michael has already found that mountain, Josh is free to use his Path to Exile to take care of it. There's no danger with giving him another mountain, since once he has one, that's going to be enough as far as what he's going to need.
Yeah, and I like this play a lot from Josh because all he wants to do is just keep the board somewhat stable. He doesn't need to answer everything, but he just needs to answer enough to keep the basically at parity, and he'll just slowly pull ahead.
Yep, so it looks like Braverman did cast that Goblin Rabblemaster. Josh Cho used his Slaughter Pact on it and has paid the upkeep. Or so he's paid the iron price for that Slaughter Pact. Now it looks like Josh is going to be able to go on the offensive with these tokens since they do have Vigilance. 3/3s every turn is going to be a lot. And here's a Timely Reinforcements. Full value, plus 6 life, plus 3 2/2s, and that is going to be rough.
Yeah, Josh is really flexing the muscles of his deck right now. I mean, he's just building more and more of a board. He's got multiple bodies. If he draws another Intangible Virtue, those bodies are going to get even bigger. He's got Gideon just pumping out more every single turn. And this is exactly why you would want to play a deck like Black-White Tokens, is because when you're in these more fair matchups, as soon as you get into a late game scenario, it's hard for other decks to keep up with all of your creatures.
And we haven't really seen Gideon all that much in Modern, and it looks real good in this deck. You would think that something like Elspeth Knight Errant might be something you would be looking at since it does create tokens, but we're not going to be really using the jump ability that effectively since we have a lot of flyers anyways, and Gideon's ability to be an Anthem effect in addition to making 2/2s is very, very good.
Yeah, when you're going so wide, that Anthem effect just has a much larger impact on your board than giving one individual creature +3/+3 and flying. Also, a lot of the tokens, the Lingering Souls tokens, the Bitter Blossom tokens, they already have flying.
So it looks like Braverman is just making some chump blocks here, playing a couple of Noble Hierarchs. The writing is all but on the wall at this point. Josh just needs to attack with all of his creatures.
Yeah, Braverman is just, slowly treading water, and now he's picking up his cards.
And we're going to see a concession here in response to that Inquisition of Kozilek, since Braverman does not want to give away any more information on what he might have in his hand. So as far as sideboarding here, do you think that there's going to be any changes on either side, or do you think they're just going to stick to what they're on?
I don't think there will be any changes. I think the one thing that Braverman would like to change is maybe a piece of enchantment removal. The other thing also is now that he's seen the Auroch Champion, he may consider boarding back in some of his Path to Exiles if he had taken some out. Gideon's also a good target for Path to Exile. So, he may tune things a little bit, but I don't think there's really going to be any big changes that are going to affect how the matchup plays out.
Yeah, I can see that. And looking at Braverman's deck, it doesn't look like he has any enchantment removal.
No, a lot of times these decks will play Kasali Pride Mage, and that's sort of their way of having enchantment removal without actually having dedicated cards like Disenchant for it. A lot of times you'll even see them play Jermoka's Command a little bit. I believe Todd Stevens, who we saw playing before, had a Jermoka's Command in his deck. But Michael Braverman, he's taken things a slightly different direction. I suspect cutting those cards is how he made room for his Rabble Masters and his Magus in the Moon.
I can see that. I can definitely see that. Same thing with Josh Cho. I don't think that either of them are really going to make any changes. While our players finish up making sure their sideboards are correct and shuffling, let's go ahead and talk about our YouTube channel really quick. So youtube.com/StarCityGames. You can check out all kinds of sweet stuff here. Versus Series archives, Premium Series archives, Open Series archives like these. So if you can't get enough CVM in the boss, you can check out the reruns on YouTube, as well as unboxings and much more on our YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe.
Yeah, I love this stuff too. The video content, I just put it on during my lunch, when I'm making breakfast in the morning, for an hour before I go to sleep. It's really where I get basically all of my Magic knowledge.
Again, that's youtube.com/StarCityGames. Let's go ahead and jump back to our match while our players are just finishing up shuffling here. Again, and we can talk about how these two games have felt kind of contrasting. In the first game, Josh was able to mount, this army of creatures, but it was a little too late because Braverman was able to punch in some damage early and then finish the game off with Burn, and Grim Lavamancer is a great card there with that repeated damage source. But the second game, Braverman just played a lot of permanents, but none of them really did anything in the face of the 2/2s that Joshua Cho was able to pump out.
Yeah, Michael Braverman, he had a lot of plays in game one. I believe he started with a Mana Accelerant and he had 2 plays on turn 2, but they just didn't actually amount to a lot of power and toughness. When he played his first Tarmogoyf, it was a 0/1, and then soon after, Josh Cho landed a Rest in Peace to make sure that Tarmogoyf would never get bigger. So I think a lot of Braverman starts are going to be more powerful than the one that we just saw. Like if he had a Rabble Master earlier, that would have been something that he could have leveraged maybe to victory. But I think generally speaking, the last game kind of tells us a lot about the matchup in that Josh Cho just wants to play for a longer game. He's got the better end game, and it's kind of on Michael Braverman to get in some damage with creatures, maybe finish Josh off with some burn. But Braverman doesn't have a lot of burn, so he's really going to need his creatures to do a lot.
I think that this is the game where we're going to see that Braverman is looking for that real aggressive start. He's going to be on the play. He's going to be able to land that Rabble Master before a lot of Josh's interaction is going to be able to come down. And that is the hope. And I have to imagine that's why he's taking a mulligan here, just to try and find that perfect aggressive opening.
Yeah, a lot of the times with a deck like Braverman's, he's really looking to just have a good start. So you'll see these aggressive decks, they'll mulligan a little bit more because they know their edge is having a good start. If they don't have that good start, they kind of lose their edge. On the other side of that, Josh Cho and a lot of other mid-range decks, They just kind of want a good mix of cards. They know that they have cards that are good at climbing them back from behind. Josh chose cards like Lingering Souls or Gideon have some good functionality when he's a little bit behind on the board, simply because they're essentially 2 permanents to deal with. So Josh Cho, you're going to see those kind of decks mulligan a lot less than the aggressive ones.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and see if Michael Braverman can come up with a good 6-card hand here. Again, remember, he does get a scry, which is going to be pretty important. That's going to increase the range of hands that he's likely to keep. But at this point, he's looking for a land, a mana accelerant, and some powerful threats. Something like Goblin Rabblemaster that he can put on the battlefield on turn 2.
Yeah, I believe in his deck he has 4 Hierarch, 4 Wild Nacatl, 1 Birds of Paradise, and 2 Grim Lavamancers. So that's 11 turn 1 plays. And so I think for something where, or for a deck where you wanted to mulligan to a 1-drop, I think you would need to have 12 or 14 1-drops. So he may be mulliganing a lot if he's looking for a 1-drop.
So it looks like here he is going to be mulliganing again, going down to 5. Josh Cho has kept his opening 7, and this just does not bode well for Michael Braverman, especially if Josh has something like Inquisition to try and punish the rest of his hand here.
Yeah, Josh has some good spot removal, some good for 1-for-1s, so Braverman can certainly have his draw picked apart. But the one good thing about Braverman's deck is a lot of his threats are individually powerful. If he just has a land, a Birds of Paradise, and a Rabblemaster, he can basically be off to the races.
Now, both of these players are in very good contention to top 8 this tournament, so while we wait for Michael to finish shuffling, let's take a quick look at the prize payouts. You can see there, first place is $5,000 and 30 SCG points. Second place, $2,025 SCG points. Top 4 will get you $1,000 and 20 SCG points, and then so on and so forth as we go down. So there is quite a bit on the line that these players are battling to have a chance to get into that top 8 and try and win some of that money.
Yeah, these opens are great value. I mean, there's good cash. The points are worth a ton. I would even say, you know, for some people, the points are basically worth more than the money. So, you know, these are just great events to go to.
Let's go ahead and go back. It looks like Michael has kept his 5. He's led with the Forest and nothing else. Joshua Cho just had a Shambling Vent, and Michael Braverman has missed his 2nd land drop, which is not boding well for him. So if Josh has something like a Bitter Blossom here, this game can steamroll out of control fairly quickly.
Yeah, and this is what we call a snowball card.
So it looks like Michael was able to pick up a Windswept Heath on his draw step here, so we might actually have a game if he's able to deploy some threats to try and combat that Bitter Blossom. But we do know that Michael Braverman has no answers to enchantments in his deck, so that Bitter Blossom is going to be on the battlefield for the entirety of the game.
Yeah, it's a real shame too, because if Braverman plays his Tarmogoyf, Bitter Blossom is a great card to put into the graveyard. That is a big boost to your
It is a tribal
Goyf.
enchantment fairy.
Yeah, really, really good. For Tarmogoyf, that is.
For Tarmogoyf.
Yeah.
So that Windswept Heath is going to find a Sacred Foundry. It's going to give him access to red and white mana, as well as turn on his Wild Nacatls.
And Josh Cho's deck is just not a deck that gets played particularly often. I mean, I've played in a lot of Modern events, and I've really only seen it a couple times. It's pretty exciting to see him do so well, and I wonder if we'll see it get played by more people in the upcoming Modern events.
That is a possibility. Now, it is important to note here that Josh does not have any basic lands on the battlefield, and if he happens to not have one this turn, next turn Michael Braverman could land, if he can hit a 3rd land and play a Blood Moon, he might just be able to lock Josh out of this game.
Yeah, that would certainly be a good line of play for Braverman if he can do it. Looks like Josh might have a discard spell that he's thinking about casting to break it up. The one thing that'll be interesting if the Blood Moon comes down is the fact that the Bitter Blossom still has potential to take over the game despite a Blood Moon being on the board.
So it looks like Michael Braverman does not have a Blood Moon in his hand. He was a little limited on his 5-card keep, but he has 2 Lightning Bolts, a Tarmogoyf, and a Collected Company. So it looks like Josh is going to have the option between a Lightning Bolt and a Tarmogoyf here, and I have to imagine he's probably going to take the Tarmogoyf.
Yeah, I believe he'll take the Tarmogoyf. The Lightning Bolts symbolize a lot less damage than the Tarmogoyf does. Also, the Tarmogoyf is basically Braverman's only good play next turn, and if Braverman doesn't hit a 2-drop or a land, he's going to have a hard time developing his game plan.
So it looks like Josh just has another Flagstones, which is going to let him thin a black-white deck, or a black-white land out of his deck, although he might just get a basic Plains here.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
So that basic plains is going to give him some protection against Blood Moon if Braverman happens to have one. But I have to imagine that at some point Josh Cho is going to start deploying things like Lingering Souls, Spectral Procession, or even Intangible Virtue is going to turn this Bitter Blossom into a big threat.
Yeah, Bitter Blossom on its own is a card that is good, not quite great, but as soon as there's an Intangible Virtue on the board, then that Bitter Blossom becomes significantly more powerful.
So Braverman did find a Noble Hierarch for his turn, so that will give him access to some more mana and make his Scavenging Ooze a 3/3 when he attacks with it. So Josh is just going to go ahead and chump with his Fairy token and go back to his turn. Now Braverman is one land away from being able to cast that Collected Company that's in his hand.
Yeah, and we might see a line of play similar to what Braverman did in Game 1, where Braverman kind of used the Bitter Blossom against Josh's own life total and complemented with a little bit of burn, a little bit of pressure from creatures, was able to finish Josh off.
Yeah, he does have those 2 Lightning Bolts in his hand, which could be very relevant. Now Josh is tapping 2 mana here. More than likely it's going to be something like Intangible Virtue. It could be another Bitter Blossom, but that might be a little risky knowing that Braverman already has 6 points of burn in his hand.
Probably one of the best things that Josh could play here is just one of those champions. It would help keep his life total stable, but it looks like he's going to be playing the Lingering Souls, and what's nice about this is he can at least threaten to trade with the Scavenging Ooze, depending on how things play out, but the fact that the Scavenging Ooze can eat the Tarmogoyf may break up that play.
So it looks like Braverman is going to use a Lightning Bolt on one of those tokens, which is going to make it so that Josh Cho is not going to be able to trade with that Scavenging Ooze when he attacks here. I imagine he was hoping to pick up another land so that he could potentially cast a Collected Company, but let's see what happens. So Braverman's going to go into the red zone with his Scavenging Ooze. Josh is going to chump block with one of his fairies. We're going to see that Lingering Souls get 8 out of Josh Cho's graveyard. He does have a land, and I kind of like this a lot better than trying to go for that Collected Company. It's much better to negate 2 more tokens coming from Josh.
Yeah, I like it. Well, I don't know. I think I actually would have liked the Collected Company better personally. I would just want to develop my board. But if Josh flashes back the Lingering Souls and plays an Intangible Virtue, that would definitely be a really bad case scenario for Braverman.
I can definitely see the merits on both of that. So Braverman's just going to go eat the Tarmogoyf out of his graveyard, gain a life, grow his Scavenging Ooze, and pass it back to Josh. He's going to make a fairy from his Bitter Blossom and then draw a card. It looks like he does have Rest in Peace in his hand.
Wow, and Josh is attacking. Bold move. I'm sure Braverman is worried about that.
Got another Bitter Blossom. And here comes the Lightning Bolt on that token. This is going to let that Scavenging Ooze get in for 4.
So I hope Josh has a Path to Exile.
Looks like he does.
And he does, okay. I don't think Josh would have made that attack if he didn't have the backup Path to Exile to keep his life total extra safe.
So that path is going to get a land from Michael Braverman. Now he is going to be able to fire off that Collected Company that he has in his hand. And if he happens to hit some very, very large creatures, that's going to continue to put Joshua Cho on the back foot. We might still see these Bitter Blossoms do a number on his life total.
Yeah, I had mentioned that we may see a line of play like the first game from Michael Braverman. The one thing that's a big difference is in the first game, Braverman had Grim Lavamancer, which was a reusable source of not only removal, but also direct damage. And it was essentially how Braverman actually finished Josh off. The fact that he's missing it this game is a pretty relevant factor, and hopefully he can find one off this Collected Company.
Well, another good pull off this Collected Company could have just been 2 Goblin Rabble Masters.
Oh, yeah,
unfortunately, it doesn't look like that's happened. He did find a Noble Hierarch and a Wild Nacatl, which while it does put a 3/3 on the battlefield and give Michael some more mana, that really isn't the fight that he's wanting to fight right now against these double Bitter Blossoms from Josh Cho.
Yeah, these companies haven't been that great for Braverman, I think, in any of the games that we've seen. One thing that I always like to think about when someone casts Collected Company is if what they got would be better than just some other 4-drop. For example, would this Collected Company have been better than, let's say, a card like Elspeth, Knight Errant?
Absolutely. Now, Michael Braverman does get hit with another Inquisition of Kozilek from Josh Cho. He does have a Collected Company in his hand, so that dream of hitting double Rabble Master is still alive, and that will really help him try and contain these Bitter Blossoms from Josh Cho if he's able to get some Rabble Masters off of this Collected Company.
Yeah, I have to imagine that's his best line of play here. I mean, it's the most powerful card in his deck.
So we have a Collected Company. We're looking at Lavamancer.
Lavamancer's good.
Noble Hierarch. And there is a Rabblemaster. So he is going to be able to get a Lavamancer and a Rabblemaster. Quite the mouthful off of this.
Yeah, and the fact that Josh doesn't have an intangible virtue or some other anthem effect like a Gideon emblem means that the tokens that are produced by this Rabblemaster are actually a pretty big deal. They can trade with Josh's tokens, and that is really relevant.
But it looks like Josh is going to put that to bed with another Path to Exile on the Rabblemaster. Before we go into the combat step, Michael will be able to get another basic land out of his deck, but that is going to stymie a lot of the aggression that he could potentially push through here.
Yeah, Braverman was really hoping that Rabblemaster would do more, and this kind of highlights, I think, one of the reasons that you don't actually see Rabblemaster that often is, and also why you don't see Knight of the Reliquary that often. I think any creature that is more than 2 mana and gets easily 1-for-1 by something like a Path to Exile is something that you need to have an extra good reason to play. Generally speaking, a lot of the creatures that you can 1-for-1 are all 1 or 2 mana, and the creatures that are 3 mana or more are creatures that have some sort of value.
Yeah, you're getting something out of it, like your Fulminator Mage, Kitchen Finks, things of that nature.
Exactly.
So we see here, Braverman does just have a Tarmogoyf that he's cast. It is a 3/4. However, Joshua Cho does have Rest in Peace in his hand that he can fire off at some point, and that's going to shut off the Tarmogoyf and that Grim Lavamancer that Braverman's been able to find and put on the battlefield with that Collected Company. And as we see here, these Bitter Blossoms are slowly starting to take over the game.
Yeah, and with this Rest in Peace, it just means so much for Josh Cho. It's shutting off 2 of Braverman's creatures, but more importantly, one of those creatures is one of Braverman's best sources of reusable damage as this board becomes more and more clogged.
As you see here, Josh Cho is attacking with both of his creatures that don't have summoning sickness, leaving back 2 blockers, one of which is probably going to chump on this Wild Nacatl, but he does need to try and finish this game as we move forward into the mid-game, because those 2 Bitter Blossoms are going to be doing 2 damage every turn to Joshua Cho as they generate those tokens.
Yeah, playing with Bitter Blossom is always an interesting situation because of the fact that it gives you a token every turn, but you lose a life every turn, and that's something that can be a little tricky to juggle. Basically, you have to negotiate your offense with your own life total.
So it looks like here Braverman was able to attack with his Wild Nacatl and that Grim Lavamancer. Josh Cho decided to chump block with both of his fairies, one of them trading with the Grim Lavamancer, and then he follows up with a Kitchen Finks, which is going to gain 2 life and present this threat that he's going to be able to attack through these tokens with. They're not going to trade.
Yeah, and if you look at the life totals right now, Michael Braverman is pretty far ahead on the life totals, and granted, the likely case scenario is that Josh Cho's board slowly becomes bigger and Braverman's board slowly becomes smaller, but Josh really needs something like an intangible virtue or some other anthem effect to make his creatures more relevant. Otherwise, Josh is unlikely to be able to kill Braverman before Josh dies to his own Bitter Blossoms.
Now it looks like Josh might have a Shambling Vent, one of those foreign cards there underneath his Godless Shrine, and if that's the case, that could be interesting just as a way to chump and potentially gain some life.
Yeah, that would any kind of life gain that he can get a hold of is certainly going to be valuable.
So we're gonna see an attack here with this Kitchen Finks, a couple Exalted triggers. So it looks like Josh is going to activate that Shambling Vent, and he's potentially just going to put everything in front.
So did Josh tap a black mana?
He did not. It looks like he does need to tap that Godless Shrine.
Yeah. Hopefully the judges will get on that or they'll figure it out. But one thing that's particularly notable about this situation is with the Rest in Peace in play, that Kitchen Finks, when it dies, it will not persist. So one of the value cards out of Michael Braverman's deck is basically not going to have an opportunity to generate any value other than a 1-for-1.
Well, it's still going to gain Braverman 2 life when it enters the battlefield, and it just killed 2 tokens and a Shambling Vent, so that's not the worst thing on the planet.
Yeah, certainly not the worst thing, but Josh is fine trading.
And he did gain 2 life from the lifelink on the Shambling Vent. And here is that intangible virtue that's just going to drastically change this game. And now Michael Braverman is under a lot of pressure and can potentially die here in the next 2 turns.
Yeah, that was really, really a big game. Basically what that means is Josh's creatures are all bigger. They all have vigilance. It's going to make it so that he's more effective at trading with his opponent. And it's going to make it so that it's easier for him to attack Michael Braverman's life total while protecting his own.
So Braverman's going to go ahead and just attack here with this Wild Nacatl. Josh is going to block since he's on a two-turn clock anyways, regardless. And at this point, all he needs to do is just attack for 6 and then attack for enough to kill him on the next turn.
So Braverman has Gavany Township, which I don't think that we've mentioned yet. That's a pretty powerful card, and in these types of situations, it can actually do a lot. But in this specific situation, Braverman's a little too far behind. He has no defense against the Flyers, and that Gavany Township is, just not enough and a little too late.
So it looks like Josh Cho did have a Ghost Quarter for his turn, which he's using on the Township when Braverman activates it. This is going to give him a couple more attackers that he can send through, but again, he's not going to be able to push through enough damage to get Josh down to 2, and then Josh is just going to be able to swing back with 3 creatures and win on the next turn. Now, I am able to see it looks like Josh has Knight of Soul's Betrayal in his hand that he boarded in against Braverman. That card seems like it's pretty good against some of the problematic cards out of Braverman's deck. A little bit of a non-bow with all of the tokens that he has in his deck, but 1 Intangible Virtue can change that.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty interesting choice for Josh to bring in, and actually pretty interesting that he even has it in his sideboard. I could certainly see how it would be used against a Splinter Twin deck to great effect. Braverman's deck, he does have a fair amount of 1 toughness creatures, but I wouldn't have expected Josh to bring it in. I guess that's more symptomatic of the fact that Josh just had a bunch of discard cards in his main deck, such as Thoughtseize, that he just wanted to take out.
So Braverman has drawn for his turn. He is in the tank here deciding what's going to be the best route to try and threaten Joshua Cho enough so that he has to block enough creatures to potentially not be able to kill him on the attack back. But depending on what he has in his hand, I'm not quite sure what he can do here. He can turn all of his creatures sideways, but it's simple enough that Josh can just block all of Braverman's creatures, lose two tokens, and still be able to win next turn.
Yeah, Braverman really wish he still had that Gavany Township to make all of his creatures gain an additional +1/+1 counter. It would have made his Noble Hierarchs and his Tarmogoyfs into 2/3s, so that he could potentially beat the tokens from Josh in combat. But as it stands now, Josh is just going to gobble everything up and still have plenty to swing back within the air and kill Braverman on the next turn.
So it looks like Braverman might have a Lightning Bolt here that he can use to whittle away some of these tokens.
Well, even as it stands, Josh still has 6 power worth of Flyers, and I believe that Josh is still going to be able to finish Braverman off on his own turn.
So Braverman's just going to pass the turn back. Josh is going to take 2 damage, make 2 fairies. They are in turn 1 of turns, but I don't think they're going to need any more. As Josh is just going to cast what looks to be either a Gideon or a Solem, or a Sorin. It's up off the board. A Sorin, he's just going to plus it, gain a bunch of life, and just finish the game.
Not only am I going to kill you, but I'm also going to gain 9 life.
Still had all these. Can't blame him, though. I would have cast it, too.
Oh, yeah, sometimes
you never know what he's got.
Yeah.
You never know.
Also, you get extra points for beating them and gaining life at the same time.
Josh Cho is racking up a lot of nerd points.
Oh, yeah, he's a very skilled nerd.